Chapter 34 The Witch of the Wilds. They stepped out of the rain and found themselves at the foot of a path. Small stone markers were set to either side, humble and unassuming, bearing no ornamentation save for the sign of the sisters, the pillar and the thorns. Overhead, branches of many trees spared them from the elements, and Kendra had the most uncanny sense of total mundanity. It was a garden path like so many others she'd seen. They made their way quickly down the little path, Kendra trying not to step too loudly. She could not have said precisely why. There simply seemed to be a sort of fragility to the place, a quiet that ought not be disturbed. The plant life was old and settled, but there were signs of new and conflicting growth. Trees with the look of careful placement and cultivation now grew into each other, choking their neighbors for light and space, and the edges of the path were newly broken with upthrust roots, stones upturned, and markers sent tumbling. It was a place that had been loved once, but now lay neglected and ailing. The path weaved through those little woods, and at times Kendra would stagger, only to be righted at the last moment by Adrian. She was in the dull haze of numbness that lies beyond drowsiness, her feet stumbling clumsily on of their own accord. At the very least, their climb had come to an end. They seemed now to be crossing the crown of that fortress of a tree, for the light passed directly above them now, filtering palely through the unwholesome leaves. The panicked notion that her strength would fail was just beginning to set in on Kendra, the weight of Caleb cutting into her like manacles, when she turned a corner and saw it. The woods thinned into a misty glade, still dense with brightly overgrown grass spackled with bramble, and at the far side of that lofty meadow was a cottage. It was an unremarkable thing, with a thatched roof and none too new wooden walls, perhaps the only ordinary thing she had seen since leaving the caravan. Kendra stared at it, disquieted by the certain sense that the house had been waiting for her down a road she had always been fated to walk down again. It sat at the bottom of a mild slope and settled comfortably on the mists, patient. "Can you help me walk?" Caleb murmured in her ear. She started. She'd not expected him to be awake. Indeed, he only seemed just barely conscious, every word exacting a great toll from him. "We're nearly there," she said, almost convincingly soothing. "You shouldn't walk. You just rest up and save your strength. I'll get you there in no time." He snorted, so weak that it was little more than exhalation, but his words were wry and clearer now. "You're just as likely to fall down this hill as walk down it. Come on, let me up. If I'm to go before one of the sisters, I want to be on my own 2 feet." And, alarmingly, he began to shift under her hold. All right. Kendra pivoted hastily to catch him as Caleb stepped to the ground and very nearly collapsed. "Fine. Have it your own fool way." "Thank you. I intend to," he replied, with a ghost of his cocky grin. Adrian moved to take him under his other arm, imitating Kendra, and together they shuffled awkwardly down that path. It eased the way inexpressibly, Caleb's cheek cutting through the dark cauldron of her thoughts, and in what seemed like another instant, they were at the door. The intervening distance seemed to have been swallowed, and Kendra felt her breath catch. This was it. Last chance. But in truth, she knew that the point of no return had passed long ago. With the slightest pause, Kendra knocked on the witch's door. There was no answer. Kendra looked tentatively to Caleb and Adrian, but it was of little help. Caleb looked rather like he might vomit, while Adrian bobbed and twitched anxiously. He had a look she did not like, mournful and wistful and ill at ease, a boy returning to his childhood haunts to find that all was not as he left it. Over Caleb's weak protests, she pulled hard on the looped handle of some smooth, dark wood, expecting it to be locked. But it wasn't. The cottage had the feel of the widower's home, who will not long outlive his wife. The shutters were drawn, dishes lay strewn across the table, and there was an odor, musty and sour, which seemed to sullenly permeate every corner and made her want to gag. It was a dingy and gray place, and a shiver of premonition ran up Kendra's back, whispering that this was not a place for her, did not belong to her. She pushed on. "Hello," she called, anxiety now overwhelming her fatigue. "Please pardon the intrusion, but is anyone here?" The silence was deafening. After a moment's trepidation, they walked through the room to a small doorway at the far end. Kendra made a cursory effort to wipe her feet clean of mud, but it was ultimately pointless. She was dripping head to toe. The hallway beyond was dismally dark, and Kendra took a shuddering breath before she could spur herself on. As they groped their way down the passage, a niggling doubt began to form in her mind. The cottage had not seemed nearly so long upon their approach. But as soon as that thought occurred to her, she planted her head firmly into a hard surface. Wincing, she fumbled in the dark and found the handle of a door. The place beyond was lit well enough to see that it was not so much a room as a den. It was littered with twigs and dried grass, but there was a certain order to it nonetheless, tokens and carved trinkets arranged around the space with obvious intent. It was lit by the pale light of that rainy morning through a small window, and Kendra saw that they were slightly below ground, the window opening directly onto a patch of soft loam and lush grass. For a moment she felt an elation that was not her own, and she was lost in the intense sensation of homecoming. She was indeed so taken that she did not notice the shifting of the shadows in one corner, the creak of a rocking chair, until the voice called her back to herself. "I was not expecting guests." With more strength than she believed he still possessed, Caleb insistently pulled her down with him to the ground. There, with barely a tremble, he settled down onto one knee, his head bowed reverently. A step behind, Kendra fumbled to imitate him, but she could not drag her eyes fully away from that figure, slowly rising from her seat. The Witch of the Wilds did not look like the figure of legend Kendra knew her to be. Far from having stepped out of a storybook, she looked small and tired and disheveled, and more like a careworn gardener than anything else. Her face was plump and good-natured, but deep circles were cut beneath sunken eyes. Slowly, Ilya regarded her, and then locked eyes with Adrian. He was still standing, and Kendra felt a swell of shame as she watched tears come into both their eyes. She went to Adrian, her footsteps a little unsteady, and laid a hand on his cheek in a wordless communion. A moment later, she turned to Kendra, eyes still sparkling. "And just what are you doing down there?" Kendra found herself off balance. She'd often thought of this moment and what she would say, but now that she was here, any words seemed inadequate. "I'm sorry," she said. It came out in a whisper, and she hastily cleared her throat. I mean, it seemed appropriate, my lady, because I am here to apologize. That is to say, I have to tell you, it's my fault. Everything that happened, it's all my fault, and I am so sorry. She finished in a rush, face hot. Kendra was not sure what she had expected. Rage, anguish, hate, any or all would be fair. Kendra did not expect that laugh, tearful and relieved. Get up, you silly thing. It's quite all right. It is? Kendra asked unbelievingly, not trusting her own ears. Of course, the witch said throatily. I'll admit you gave me quite a scare for a while there, and in due time you'd better explain yourself and properly. Genevieve thought, well, but you know she can be a bit pessimistic. But I knew you'd come back to me in the end. Kendra's guts turned to lead in the face of that beaming smile as Ilya reached down to her. It's just good to see you again, Keenan. Kendra dazedly allowed herself to be pulled to her feet, and as their hands met, Kendra thought she saw a flicker of something unidentifiable and dark in the witch's eyes. Then Ilya was pulling her close and embracing her. She had an unwashed smell, hair falling over Kendra in knotted tangles, and heavy tears were smudging against her face. Looking over the woman's shoulder, she saw the same shock and worry mirrored in the faces of her friends. I think there's been a mistake, she stammered faintly. I'm sorry. I'm not Keenan. Ilya pulled away sharply and laughed, too hard. Not Keenan, she cried with hysterical mirth. I'll admit that new shape of yours has caught me a bit by surprise. All scarred up like that. Well, you always had peculiar tastes, but it will take more than that to fool me for long. She laid a hand between Kendra's long ears, patting her hair almost tenderly. If I were blind, I would still know you, the feel of your heart. But it's true, Kendra said, a little desperately now. I didn't mean to, but I... Enough, Ilya said, raising a hand to forestall her. I said I would forgive you, but let's have no more of these little games. You upset me very much indeed, running off like that for so long. I'm just glad Adrian finally got you to come back home. At least one of you has a bit of sense. My lady, I don't... No more of this my lady talk, either, she insisted. To you, I'm just Ilya. No matter how put out I might be with you, nothing can change that. Now then, who is this? She gestured down to Caleb with detached curiosity, forcibly changing the subject. I am Caleb, of the Living City, he said, his voice tense with suppressed pain. It is an honor to meet you, my lady. I am Kendra's companion and guardian and friend. Kendra? Ilya asked airily. Oh, dear Keenan, you even took a new name for this new form of yours? You and your fancies, goodness me. She turned back down to Caleb with something like indulgent amusement. So, you've been helping Kendra make his way home, is that right? I'm sure that must have been quite an adventure. Caleb glanced at Kendra uneasily. I've done what I could to help, yes," he allowed, his voice rougher now. "A lot has happened." "Ilya," Kendra said carefully, "my friend was badly hurt bringing me back here. He's been poisoned by a manticore. He's not well at all. I'm sorry to have upset you so much, but please, he means a lot to me. Is there anything you can do for him?" Kendra felt like the lowest kind of filth as she watched Ilya's eyes light up at the use of her name. The witch was not in her right mind, and she was exploiting that vulnerability, encouraging the delusion. "Of course," Ilya breathed, almost ecstatic. "You always did like to play rough, didn't you? A manticore! Oh, by the gods, Keenan, you really must be more careful about what you get your playmates into. Even the Sylvan races have their limits. Well, under the circumstances, we'll overlook your indiscretions for now. We can patch him up if you like. Oh, it's just good to have you home." Ilya waved them out of the room, gabbling away excitedly, beckoning them further on into the cottage. Caleb was giving Kendra an outraged glare, but she did not meet his eyes. Perhaps it was low to take advantage of her in this way, but she could play the villain a while longer if only it meant Caleb would live. She took him over one shoulder and shuffled along behind. The hallway went on further still, impossibly stretching the dimensions of the cottage. Darkness pressed heavy on Kendra's fraying nerves. Finally, a door opened before them, and light streamed in. Kendra blinked with relief, then stared into what was the most peculiar room she'd ever seen, yet also as familiar as her childhood bedchambers. It was like being inside an immense bird's nest, which seemed appropriate in Kendra's dissociated speculations, given their position high up in the enormous tree. The walls of interwoven branches curved up in a wide, flattened circle. They were lined with untidy shelves, which in turn were littered with talismans and herbs in jars. Work surfaces, each in total disarray, were scattered with detritus and covered in scrawling runes, the unmistakable tokens of weeks of frantic, scrambling study. And at the center of the room, the source of that initially blinding light, there was a large hole in the ceiling, a man's height in diameter, with a matching cut in the floor below. Mist and rain passed through them, and Kendra knew without seeing that the hole opened up to a drop that would run the full length of the citadel. "It's fortunate timing, too," Ilya commented absently, picking through the mess for the necessary supplies. "Morning's first rays are just the stuff for a proper healing, even on a day like this. Now, sit yourself down there. Caleb, was it?" She gestured to the opening in the floor. "Not too close now, of course." Caleb obeyed automatically, but the doubt in his eyes was growing, burning a turbulent scarlet. With the witch's back turned, Kendra shook her head pleadingly at him. He had to understand. There was no time, no choice. Just be quiet for once, she thought desperately. But he gave her no sign, only staring back, unreadable, the wind-tossed rain casting a silver shroud over his back. After a minute's searching and puttering, Ilya turned back to them, her arms laden with a small assortment of herbs and implements of unknown provenance. "That should do it," she muttered to herself. "Now, just you sit still, and we'll get started right away. You poor thing, You're not looking well at all." "My lady, if I might speak a moment." Kendra's blood froze. Caleb was looking up, respectful but resolute. Ilya frowned for a moment, considering him as if she was seeing him for the first time. "Go on, then," she said, her tone neutral in a way that did nothing to set Kendra at ease. "Thank you, my lady. I speak now, not to bring you pain or offer insult, but only because I hold you in too high an esteem to come to you under false pretenses."
"What's this all about?"
Ilya asked, and her voice was less controlled now.
"Keenan, what is he saying?"
"It's nothing, Ilya," Kendra replied, shrill in her own ears. "He's terribly sick. I'm sure he doesn't know what he's saying. Caleb, shut up." He gave her a weary half-smile. "I know you mean the best by it, Kendra, but I can't do this. I owe everything to the sisters, my very existence. My people would have been wiped out but for their generosity. To dishonor either of them would stand against everything I am and everything I believe in." Ilya was staring now with eyes forbidding and wild, but if it bothered Caleb, he did not show it. He addressed her calmly as Kendra stared, paralyzed. "I cannot accept this boon for bringing your familiar home to you, my lady, because I did not do so." Ilya laughed, but there was no mirth in the sound.
"You are delirious, so I will show you a bit of patience for your delusions. Of course you brought him home. Keenan is standing right there."
"I'm sorry, my lady, but that is not her name. She isn't Keenan, and Keenan isn't coming back." Suddenly, Ilya was grabbing Caleb by the collar, shaking him.
"Stop it!"
she cried, and her voice was throbbing now, close to tears.
"I won't hear this madness. I won't. Not from Genevieve, and certainly not from you, young man."
They were slipping nearer to that precipice, the room curving down gently to it, and Caleb's hair was slick anew with rain. Fear shattered Kendra's horrified stupor, and she ran forward, grabbing the Witch of the Wilds by a shoulder and pulling her off him. Locking her hands tight, Kendra cried frantically into Ilya's face, "Stop it, please! Please leave him alone. It's not his fault. It's mine." As Kendra held her, the frenzied energy drained out of the woman. Her thrashing arms went slack, and her eyes cleared, leaving only awful emptiness.
"Oh, gods, you're really not him,"
she said hollowly, tears running down a blank face. Kendra hesitated, her own throat tight and aching, and for a moment she almost pulled the witch into a hug. But that was no gesture for a killer to give a victim. So she stepped back and only nodded.
"Why do you feel like him?"
Ilya asked, huskily, but still clear, still controlled.
"I was so sure of it when you walked into the room. So sure. How can you have his essence but not be him?"
"I don't understand it very well," Kendra explained smallly. "But I killed him. I shot him with an iron arrow, and I ate him. I thought he was just a normal hare. I didn't think... Well, it doesn't really matter what I thought. You can feel him in me because, in some way, he is in me." Ilya said nothing for a long time, but her stare was intense and present in a way that she'd not been before. Kendra felt the gaze linger long over her ill-gotten rabbit's ears, but she stood and waited. If Ilya wanted time, Kendra owed it to her as much as was needed. Still, her eyes flickered back to Caleb more and more often now. He had hardly moved since the witch's onslaught, and his eyes were glazed over. She did not like that look, did not like how he swayed at that edge, and she shuffled a few steps nearer.
"Lady Ilia," she finally said, pained, "I know that I have no right to ask you for anything, but Caleb doesn't have much time. Please, if you can, help him."
Something softened in that sharp expression.
"I will help him," she said quietly, "but there is something I want from you as well."
There was a strange note in that voice. It was almost apologetic.
"Of course," Kendra replied uncertainly. "If there's anything I can do to make up for even a small part of the hurt I've done to you, anything at all, I'll do it gladly."
Ilia nodded, and it was almost a childlike gesture, a toddler's acceptance when her mother said that everything would be all right.
I need to have Keenan back," she said, and her voice broke now. "He's always been there, since the beginning nearly. He's my right hand, my heart, the best part of me. Without him,
Kendra looked down hurriedly, her eyes stinging. She had no right to cry here, not in front of her.
"I'm sorry. I don't think that's possible. I can't undo the past, however much I'd like to." "There's a way."
Kendra raised her gaze, stunned, but Ilia was watching her own fidgeting hands.
"It's not too late, I don't think. You haven't fully attuned yourself to his essence, his spirit. For now, you're two souls in one body, even if the lines between you have started to blur." "You could bring him back?"
The words ran through her like an electric current, too incredible to believe. Never had she dared imagine there might be some way to make things right.
"If you can do that, if it's possible, then of course I'll—"
She trailed off. Ilia was still not looking at her.
"It's not precisely a matter of bringing him back," Ilia said softly. "Nothing can bring a soul back from beyond the veil, but he's still here, in you. I can feel him. I'm sure you can too, sometimes. That's what would make it possible to remove the other soul."
Kendra's tongue felt clumsy and heavy in her mouth.
"The other soul," she said, stupefied. "You mean my soul? You want to remove my soul?" Fresh tears ran down Ilya's face. "It's a terrible thing to do, a terrible and unnatural act of magic, and the powers that I'll have to channel—"
The witch fell silent for a moment, and beneath the grief and the anguish, Kendra thought she saw a flicker of something else, some doubt or fear.
"But it's the only way," she went on tremulously. "There's nothing else I can do to change what you've done. I'm sorry. I wish there were another way, but there are limits to even my power. This is the only choice left to me."
They stood quietly then. Kendra felt very far away, as if watching it all from the bottom of a deep well, Ilya's words echoing down around her head. She heard Caleb's feverish whisper, "There's always a choice," but it was a faint and empty thing. Not this time, she realized. The path she'd walked had always led to this place, from the moment that arrow had left her hand, or maybe even before that. Since she'd run away from home? since these scars had been burned across her face? Perhaps. All that was certain was that she found herself here, and there was a part now to play, a role only she could assume. She looked into Ilya's eyes with their unspoken plea, and nodded. "You're right. If this is the only way to bring back Keenan, then it's what we have to do." Ilya reached out for a moment, quivering with emotion, before pulling back her hands to clasp tightly about her breast.
"Bless you, child," she murmured. "Thank you."
Then she was hurrying off to a corner, pushing through one of the cluttered workbenches, muttering tearfully. Kendra stared dazedly after her when something tugged at her sleeve. She looked down and almost fell under a second tug. Caleb was grabbing her, teeth gritted, clambering to his feet. "What are you doing?" she asked in a hiss, anger cutting through her fog as she reached out to hurriedly support him. "You have to rest until she's ready to help you. Need I remind you that you're on death's door?" "I guess I'll be in good company," he growled, leaning heavily against her. "You seem much more eager than I am to get yourself killed. Damn you, this isn't what we came here for." "It is," Kendra snapped. "This is how I make this right. I save you, and I save her, and I save Keenan. This is the best possible outcome." "Funny how the best outcomes never involve saving you." He swayed, turning drunkenly around to face Ilya. "My lady," he said, his voice barely audible, "forgive me, but this is wrong. We came at the behest of your sister to bring you the proof that you must take a new familiar." Ilya did not turn to look. She only shook her head fiercely and continued her rummaging. "You clearly have no idea what you're talking about, boy. There's no reason to take a new familiar, not when my Keenan is not gone." "He is," Caleb said raggedly. "He is dead, and even you must respect the laws of the world. It is true that I could never hope to match you in your learnings and wisdom, but even I know that to tear souls asunder and return the dead to the living will be a dark and dangerous act." Slamming her supplies down on the table, the witch whirled around, and Kendra took a step back in alarm. "Do not presume to speak to me about the tearing of souls, boy!" she shrieked, and true madness glinted in her eyes. "You do not know, you cannot know how I suffer. The pact I have with Keenan is not some triviality to be cast aside. Our spirits are as one. He is more dear to me than life itself. I can no more abandon him than I can cut out my own heart. I would sooner die. Indeed, there is nothing I would not do to bring him back." "My lady, I have no doubt that you would move heaven and earth for him," Caleb murmured. He sounded desperately weak. "If you set your mind to it, I do not think anything could stop you. Such is your strength, and the strength of your love. That is why I am certain that you are strong enough to know when it is time to let go." Ilya was on the floor now, her breath coming in bursts, hands about her head as if warding off ghosts. "You don't believe his nonsense, do you?" she asked wretchedly, her eyes now seeking Kendra's. "It's not right for us to be apart, not fair. You'll help me, won't you? You wouldn't keep us apart any longer, would you? You said you'd help me fix this. Please, I can't be without him. I can't. Kendra stared
as the witch of the wilds descended into blubbering, broken sobs, and was ashamed of the feelings that rushed through her, setting her heart pounding fit to burst. She had no right to be horrified, no right to be afraid. This was all of her own doing. She was far more pathetic than Ilya, even now, to cling so to her own worthless life. Was she truly so small and so vile, an abhorrent and thrashing insect that could not for a moment think of more than herself? There was a bump against her shoulder, and she started. There was Adrian, face buried into her arm. He was warm and soft beside the sting of the morning wind that lashed from the opening in the floor, and she leaned instinctively into that gentle presence. He was facing away from Ilya, and trembling spasms shook through his lean frame. It occurred to her that he must have known Ilya for as long as he had Genevieve, an eternity. They were family too, something like aunt and nephew, or mother and son. And now Kendra had wounded her, laid her low, until Adrian could not stand to look upon her. It was too much, too awful. No, she could not sanction it. In the end, she could only be so shameless. Swallowing hard, she laid a hand on his head and found her voice. "I'll do it, Ilya," she said, her smile terrible to behold. "I'll make this right, even if I have to give my life to do it." Ilya's eyes shone, bloodshot and glazed. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you, thank you. Oh, you're a good boy. I knew you'd come back. I knew you wouldn't leave me, Keenan." Fingers interlaced around her shoulder, and Kendra looked down, confused. Caleb's body was tense, the muscles in his neck straining, until at last he took his own weight and rose nearly to his full height beside her. They stood like that, him looking down at her in his arms, and a crooked bastard grin stole across his lips. Taking fistfuls of her shirt, he brought her into a close hug and stepped backward over the edge. By the time Kendra realized what was happening, it was too late. She tried to right herself, but she was tired, and Caleb's dead weight pulled inexorably down on her. Together they teetered over the brink, seemingly suspended during that frozen instant, and Kendra looked around her. As she sank, the room seemed to spin, an inevitable maelstrom. Adrian was lurching forward, extending a hand that she knew would not arrive in time. A gust of wind was rising, sending papers and detritus swirling. But it was Ilya who held her gaze to the last. Kendra was not sure she had ever seen such an expression. The witch looked as if she had received a mortal wound, as if the world were ending. Her mouth was wide, lips stretched over her gums, and tears and snot ran through deep-pulled trenches in her twisted face. But it was those eyes that grabbed at Kendra, pulled at her until she thought that perhaps they would yet haul her back over the edge of the precipice. They popped and bulged, flashing with the unmitigated madness of the drowning man. For a moment, Kendra felt certain that someone else dwelt there just below the surface, in the long hallways of the witch's fractured mind, and stared back at her from just beyond the fragile windows of those eyes. Kendra could not bear it. She looked away. They fell through the porthole, and above them, Ilya began to scream.